Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to begin with Malachi Throne, who died recently at the age of 84. Malachi Throne was a nice Jewish boy from New York City. He came home from the Korean War and started out with a career in the theater. He had a nice, classically trained voice. He appeared on a lot of Broadway and off-Broadway stuff in the early 1950s. He was trained by Uta Hagen and William Hickey, and he did a little work on the Dumont television network. But ultimately, as so many actors did in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he migrated out to Southern California, and he became basically a B-grade television star. He had a lot of roles on Star Trek. He was offered the role of Bones, but he turned it down, and a co-starring role opposite Robert Wagner in It Takes a Thief. But Malachi Throne's most famous role was as one of the villains in Batman. In fact, he was one of the last 9 surviving guest star villains in Batman, and he was Falseface. He wore a mask so you never saw his real face, and here's a little bit of him trying to outwit the dynamic duo.
Gotham City. A fitting day for nuptials, exhibits, or grand theft.
Look out, cops. I hereby crown myself. Signed, Falseface.
Yes, he's back again. That infamous criminal master of trickery and disguise.
I am the Princess Mertenberg. What is this I hear? My crown will be stolen.
Oh, we'll keep it safe for you, your highness.
Oh, so? Then what is this?
All that glitters is gone. Shouldn't that be all that glitters is gold?
Oh, that's the trademark of Falseface, a false quote. But the crown is here and safe.
Not quite, Chief O'Hara.
It's Falseface.
In disguised person. All you assembled?
The counterfeit crew ready and on duty, Falseface.
Good. First, men, I've succeeded in lifting the Mergenberg crown.
Tell it again, FF.
Only the beginning, in starting off step 2 of my overall plan. Boys, we are about to double-dizzy Batman and Robin until the dexterous duo is duped, decoyed, and diabolically destroyed. I have planned the greatest creation of my covert criminal career. Falseface will stamp his disguised image on all Gotham City.
Today, Gotham City, tomorrow, the world.
Great cheers for FF! Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!
Thanks, men. I know you didn't mean it. But back to business. Batman and Robin must go.
Batman and Robin. Come to look at the puzzle? No, we've come to prevent a withdrawal. Like Falseface. What? Falseface? Notorious criminal? Master of disguise?
Then we better load the money in the truck before it's too late, old buddy.
It's already too late. Falseface!
What? Right. That's Falseface himself, in disguised person.
Yeah, what makes you so sure?
It's obvious. Only a criminal would disguise himself as a licensed bonded guard, yet callously park in front of a fire hydrant.
It's always the little things.
This time it'll cost you a big penalty, Falseface. We're going to withdraw you from circulation and deposit you in jail.
Well, Boy Wonder, your interest is overdue.
Can't beat that dialogue. When Malachi Throne played Falseface on the first of 2 episodes of Batman, it created a big stir because you couldn't see his face, and when the credits rolled, they had an X rather than identify the actor. So there was speculation all over the United States who was Falseface. And the big speculation at the time was that it was somebody from the Rat Pack, that it was either Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin or Peter Lawford. What the real story was, Malachi Throne was a little upset that his co-star Femme Fatale got $25,000 and he got scale for playing Falseface, so he instructed the producers to put an X instead of his name on the credits. His agent figured out that that would be a good gimmick, and they identified him at the end of the 2nd episode and cleared up the mystery. Basically, they told those villains on Batman that they couldn't overact, so you got all these great actors just hamming it up unmercifully. With the death of Malachi Throne, there are only 8 left: Julie Newmar, John Astin, Eli Wallach, Joan Collins, Glynis Johns, Barbara Rush, Dina Merrill, and Zsa Zsa Gabor. So we say goodbye to Falseface, aka Malachi Throne. Our feature tonight is the most famous stalker in sports history, Ruth Ann Steinhagen, who died recently at the age of 83. Ruth Ann Steinhagen has an amazing story. She was born in Chicago and she grew up on the north side of the city, not far from Wrigley Field, and she naturally gravitated towards the Cubs and became a big Chicago Cub fan. When she was a teenager, she followed the players on the Cubs with a passion that bordered on the religious, but her attention was especially directed towards the handsome first baseman of the Cubs, Eddie Waitkus. She would set a place for him at the dinner table. She turned her bedroom into a shrine to him, and she put his photo under her pillow. Unfortunately, after the 1948 season, Eddie Waitkus was traded from the Cubs to the Philadelphia Phillies, and Ruth Ann Steinhagen developed a plan for the first time the Phillies were in Chicago in 1949. In June of that year, Ruth Ann was 19. When the Phillies came to town, she checked into the beautiful pink Edgewater Beach Hotel, which was only a couple blocks from Wrigley Field, and the visiting team stayed there. And she sent a note to Eddie Waitkus after a game one day. The note asked him to come to her room after the game, which he did, and when he got there, she shot him. The wound wasn't fatal, but it kept him out of the 1949 season. Here's the story of Ruth Ann Steinhagen and Eddie Waitkus.
Eddie Waitkus was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts on September 4th, 1919. Waitkus grew up in a time of growing player popularity within sports, in part by radio broadcasts. When people like Graham McNamee and Bill Stern covered baseball games for the radio, they focused on iconic players, launching these players to stardom. When Eddie Waitkus entered the scene in the 1940s, fans of the game considered players as heroes. Eddie Waitkus burst onto the scene with the Chicago Cubs in 1946. In 1948, Waitkus enjoyed a career year, batting .300 and making the All-Star team for the Chicago Cubs, and he still showed the promise of more improvements to come. This talent made him trade bait, however, and in the following year, the Cubs traded him to Philadelphia. Waitkus did not skip a beat, however, making the All-Star team for the Phillies the following year. Although during his time in Chicago, he unknowingly gained attention from a troubled young woman named Ruth Steinhagen. As a child, Ruth Steinhagen did not want people to look at her. She did not like being the center of attention. She found an escape for her troubles at Wrigley Field. Ruth Steinhagen grew a fascination with Eddie Waitkus during the Cubs baseball games. She fed her obsession by stalking him on game day at Wrigley Field. She went to the games with her then-boyfriend to stare at Eddie for the entire game. As her obsession grew worse, she would collect every newspaper article and picture that she could find and build a shrine to him in her bedroom. She became obsessed with anything connected with him. Eddie was from Lithuanian descent, so she began taking classes to speak the language in a crazy attempt to be closer to him. In 1948, she left her job to wander around the city in search of Eddie. Waitkus' trade to Philadelphia deprived Ruth of her obsession and steadily pushed her to madness. The only thing that fed her obsession was now gone, over 750 miles away. On June 14, 1949, when the Phillies were playing in Chicago, Ruth Steinhagen left Eddie Waitkus a note to visit an old friend in the Edgewater Beach Hotel. When Waitkus went to the room to see his friend, Ruth was waiting for him and told him that his friend had left, but would return soon. When Waitkus sat down to wait, Ruth pulled out a .22 rifle and shot him point blank in the chest. After she had shot him, she calmly walked into the hallway and yelled, "I shot Eddie Waitkus." When police arrived, Steinhagen was sitting calmly in the room with Eddie and was taken into custody. Eddie was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery and almost died on the hospital table several times. As the radio thrust Eddie into the limelight, Ruth Steinhagen saw Eddie Waitkus as a hero. The growing fascination with professional athletes came to a dangerous level. Waitkus was not the only baseball player to be shot around this time. Billy Georgius, a shortstop for the Cubs in 1934, also was shot a few years earlier in Chicago by a woman who he was romantically linked. Radio announcers used players' actions on the field as representations for lifestyles and values at the time in America. These shootings greatly increased security for professional athletes. Professional athletes seemed to keep being hoisted higher and higher by the American culture of baseball. It's gained a celebrity status from radio coverage of games and acts of obsession like this one.
Ruth Ann Steinhagen was deemed to be insane at the time and was sent to Kankakee State Hospital for 3 years of psychiatric treatment. When she got out in 1952, she was eligible to be tried for shooting Eddie Waitkus, but Waitkus decided not to press charges. Ironically, that same year, Bernard Malamud came out with a book called The Natural. And in The Natural, there's a famous scene of a great baseball player who's shot by a woman who invites him to her hotel room. So it's pretty safe to assume that Malamud was influenced by the story of Ruth Ann Steinhagen and Eddie Waitkus. That scene was reenacted in the 1984 movie The Natural, with Robert Redford as the baseball player and Barbara Hershey as the young woman who shoots him.
How far is it to the stadium? Go to the hotel first. Come on, we gotta get over to the hotel. I want to get a drink. Oh. Hello?
Hello, Roy. This is Harriet.
Excuse me?
Harriet Birds.
Oh.
The door's open.
Hello? How did you know I was staying at this hotel? What's going on here?
Roy, will you be the best there ever was in the game?
That's right.
The scene from The Natural based on the story of Ruth Ann Steinhagen and Eddie Waitkus. After Ruth Ann Steinhagen came out of Kankakee State Hospital and wasn't prosecuted, she lived for over the next 50 years fairly anonymously. She lived with her parents and her sister on the northwest side of the city, not that far from the Edgewater Beach Hotel. When her parents died, she lived with her sister. Most of her neighbors had no idea who she was. They had no idea where she worked. She worked for an employer for 35 years, but as I said, most people didn't even know who that employer was. Her closest neighbor lived next door to her for 15 years before he found out her story. When she died, even the people at the morgue did not know who Ruth Ann Steinhagen had been, even though more than 50 years before she'd been national headlines. Shortly after Ruth Ann was committed, a doctor published a case report about her in the American Journal of Psychiatry. As for Eddie Waitkus, he won the Comeback Player of the Year award in 1950 for the Phillies. They were the Whiz Kids, and they won the pennant that year. He died in 1972, over 40 years ago. And as for Cub fans, well, they still want to shoot Cub players. It's not because they have an obsession with them. It's just the way the Cubs have been playing. Remember, it was 4 years before Ruth Ann Steinhagen shot Eddie Waitkus that the Cubs won their last pennant. I want to mention the death of Steve Davis, who died in a plane crash recently at the age of 60. Steve Davis was the quarterback for the University of Oklahoma from 1973 to 1975, when the Sooners went 32-1-1 and won 2 national championships. During that stretch, the Sooners won 28 straight games. Davis wasn't the best player on that team, but he was the brains and the heart of the Sooners. In 1976, Steve Davis was the most valuable player in the Orange Bowl when the Sooners beat University of Michigan 14-6. He also was a preacher while he was playing football and continued preaching throughout the rest of his life. Here's a report on Steve Davis with a tribute to him from Jamel Holloway, who was another great Oklahoma quarterback.
Once again, Steve Davis, the ordained Baptist preacher, had led Oklahoma from the shadow of defeat to victory. Just as he had done in every game, he had quarterbacked at OU, with the exception of the tie with USC in 1973 and the upset loss to Kansas.
I think the greatest quarterback that ever came through Oklahoma, really, me personally, I think Steve Davis is the best one because he won 2 national championships. I mean, even though they had great defense, I mean, wow, Selman brothers, but still, you won 2 national championships, and that's pretty hard to do.
Well, there's a lot of pressure being put back in Oklahoma, but it's the type of pressure that one appreciates, the people you're surrounded with, the coaches. It's an experience that you get to enjoy, but it's been great for me.
Steve Davis no different than me or anybody else. He knew he had to work hard every day because there's always going to be somebody going to try to take your job and come in. And there's some talented guys came in to quarterback, but they never could take the job. He was just a heck of a player.
For what he was off the field, as much as for what he did on the field, Steve Davis is a player that Sooner fans will never forget.
That's pretty much right. They'll never forget Steve Davis. He'll always be a legend in Boomer Sooner Nation. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Taps. And in closing tonight, we're going to pay tribute to another one-hit wonder. That would be Claude King, who died recently at the age of 90. Claude King was a country music singer out of Louisiana. He was a mainstay on the old Louisiana Hayride show, where people like Elvis, Hank Williams, and Johnny Cash got their exposure. 1962, Claude King recorded a song called Wolverton Mountain. Huge hit, million seller, #1 on the country charts, #6 on the pop charts. It's the story of a mountain man named Clifton Clowers, and it's actually based on a real-life character from Arkansas who was the uncle of the songwriter Merle Kilgore. Before I play Claude King's definitive version, I'm going to play a couple of other versions by some pretty heavy people. Here's Bing Crosby's version of Wolverton Mountain.
They say don't go on Wolverton Mountain if you're looking for a wife. 'Cause Clifton Clowers has a pretty young daughter, and he's mighty handy with a gun and a knife.
How about Nat King Cole?
They say don't go on Wolverton Mountain if you're looking for a wife. 'Cause Clifton Clowers has a pretty young daughter. He's mighty handy with a gun and a knife.
And even Louis Armstrong covered Wolverton Mountain.
They say don't go on Wolverton Mountain if you're looking for a wife. 'Cause Clifton Clowers has a pretty young daughter. He's mighty handy with a gun and a knife.
Now be honest, you never heard Louis Armstrong sing country music before, did you? But that's just a measure of how big a song Wolverton Mountain was. And as I said, the definitive version was by Claude King.
They say don't go on Wolverton Mountain if you're looking for a wife. 'Cause Clifton Clowers has a pretty young daughter. He's mighty handy with a gun and a knife. Her tender lips are sweeter than honey, and Wolverton Mountain protects her there.